Great. So without further ado, Steve, are you there? I'll get you to pop yourself up and say hello quickly.
Okay.
There we go. Fabulous. I can hear you. Is it as hot over in Australia as it is here? Are we just complaining because we're British?
Well, I mean, when it's summer here, you know, your temperatures are just sort of moderate. I mean,
Yeah.
where I used to live in summer, we'd hit 50 degrees. So,
Oh my gosh, 50 degrees. I don't think I can I can't even imagine that. I can't even imagine it. We'd definitely complain a lot about that if it hit 50 degrees, blimey. But great, listen, I will leave you to it, Steve, and please chat to us about termites. That'd be great.
Okay, so let me share my screen first up. Share, and then bring up my presentation.
There we go, looking great.
Looks like it's already up. Okay. I'm not sure if I can get rid of this over here because I've got something on here that's hiding all my screen.
Are you struggling to see your presentation just for you? We can see it perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, something's going. So I'm going to start again here. Now I've got something that's showing on my screen that hides it from me. Yeah. So anyway, I've got that out the way now, I think. And okay, so hopefully now you can see termites, evolution, biology, and ecology with a picture of a couple of termite soldiers, in which case I will keep going.
Fantastic, we can. Thank you, Steve.
So I guess in Australia, when it comes to pest control, we're very blessed to have termites. I have people who say to me, oh, gosh, they're such terrible pests, aren't they? And I say, well, they've made me a lot of money because they really are the most destructive timber pests in the world. And certainly our company, at least 50% of our turnover comes from termite management products, and most pest control companies would be split that way, or maybe even more in their termite income. When we look at termites, we traditionally see them as located between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, but we are seeing them expanding out of that. And really, that's mainly where we have land connections. So when we look at Australia, the whole of mainland Australia has termite problems, but we certainly have seen those problems increasing in the south of Australia, which is where we have our cooler climates, as we've seen global warming taking place. So we're seeing these termite migrations. In my home state of Tasmania, which is an island to the very south of Australia, where it's -4 probably at the moment, in rather contrast to where you are. We don't have termites, but the whole of mainland Australia. And so they do certainly need the warmer climates. Three things make for a termite market. Obviously, the presence of termites, which we've just covered, the presence of people, because termites really only become a pest when they interact with people. Probably 80% or more of termites basically are grass or vegetation feed.
Steve, sorry to interrupt. Are you moving your screen across? Because I don't think it's changing for us.
No, not yet.
Are you still on the first one? Good, just checking. Thank you.
Yes, they need people because 80% of termites really don't even eat timbers. They eat cellulosic materials in grasses and plants. And then obviously they clean up the timbers in the forest. So it only becomes a problem when they interact with humans and our human habitations. And then the third thing is obviously you have to have money. So the markets tend to be large in OECD countries where we can afford the cost of treatments, because termites are not cheap to deal with. So what sort of damage do termites do? In the top right there, hopefully you've seen my slide change on now. In the top right there, you can see a home in the Northern Territory of Australia. Superficially looks quite all right until we step inside, and you can see the sort of extensive damage that termites can do. And they have literally been known to sort of almost totally destroy a house within a 3-month period. The damage is extensive. They will hollow out the timbers. often just leaving timber superficially looking as though it's intact, but totally hollowed out within. And this is because termites are cryptic species. This means the termites that we're dealing with, they're concealed within the timbers at all times. And so we very rarely see the presence of termites until we sort of do a more thorough inspection, or the timbers just give out. The main termite species we deal with are what we call subterranean species. This is where the colony is now found below ground, and they travel through tunnels through the ground and up into the property. And they will expose themselves often with mud tunneling, which you'll see in the bottom right corner. You can see a bit of it here, but they set up what we call bivouacs, which is areas of heightened activity. So it's not actually the colony that we're seeing, but we can see all this mudding inside the timbers, which is like a staging post. So there may be 1,000 termites, or thousands of termites in those mudded areas within the timbers. They'll be very hot to the touch, and they'll be using those to spread out and cause damage to the timbers in the building in their never-ending searching for cellulose. Here we can see some of these axes where they show their presence. Now, we're seeing rather obvious ones in those pictures there, but sometimes those galleries can be very, very tiny and very difficult to find on inspection. And as you can imagine, with a typical brick veneer house construction, which may not be so common, I don't know, in the UK, certainly in Australia, where we have a brick on the outside, we have gyprock on the inside, and then in between the two, we have a timber frame. So it's often very difficult to find out that there's been any termite attack until we get up into the roof void, unless we see evidence of these termite trails. In the bottom corner here, this is one of the common ways we control termites now is with baiting systems. That's what our company was founded on. And here you can see an above ground station that's been placed on the termite activity. The termites will feed on the bait, take that back to the colony, which will lead to the elimination of the termite colony. And they can get into the electrics and do extensive damage in the electrics, even through to causing fires. And the mud tunneling that you can see, mudding that you can see on the right, that can literally occur overnight. We've literally had cases such as that where that amount of mudding just happens overnight. That's how active they can be in the extreme situations that we sometimes come across. We've seen them get into the corks of wine bottles and destroy wine bottles. Basically anything that has a cellulosic content is what they'll get into. Wiring they will get into, as we just saw before. And what I tend to say is, because we're always being surprised by termites, they don't sort of follow the rules. And so my favorite saying about termites is, the problem with the termites is they don't read the textbooks, they eat them. And here you can see a classic example of just that. So let's now move on then to look at how termites as an insect species evolved. And first off, let's look at how we classify insects. I won't spend too much time on this. Hopefully you're familiar with this, but basically the classification system that we follow to this day was developed by Linnaeus, and this is way back in the 1870 when he first classified I think it was 5 species of phasmids. And basically every species of living organism that's on the planet is designated into one of various systems of classification, leading to grouping by similarity. So we see classification through what you see on the left there, which I'll cover more detail in the next slide. But they're put together in these groupings based on the Linnaean system, which back in those days was just on their physical attributes. So we said, look, this animal looks like this animal, so they must be related, so we'll put them in this group. And that's how it evolved right the way through until Charles Darwin came along. And you will all know Charles Darwin and the origin of species. And So now this brought an aspect of evolution to how we classified things. So we still follow the Linnaean system, but now what we've done with Charles Darwin's knowledge that we had, we said, let's group them on how they evolved and their evolutionary links. And so that's then how we develop things. And then, of course, in more recent times, in the last 50 years, we've seen the discovery of DNA, and more particularly, and this is why I made in the last 50 years, is more particularly we've seen techniques whereby we can identify the genes within an organism. And so by DNA typing, we can very, very clearly identify whether this is a single species we're looking at or whether they're two different species because their DNA is different. And through their DNA typing, we can much more closely identify and understand the evolution of the various species. So when we look at the evolution of termites, they belong to the eukarya domain. This is the domain of cellular organisms with a nucleus. In the animal kingdom, in the phylum Arthropoda, so we're narrowing it down. Arthropoda, of course, is covering insects, but it also covers all segmented animals, so crabs, lobsters, prawns, spiders. We then come down to the class Insecta, which is now 3 body segments, 6 legs, as you know, and within the superorder Dictyoptera. And then if you'd read a scientific paper as recently as 15 years ago, and certainly up to 20 years ago, you would have seen that they filled in the order Isoptera. And the Isoptera was the order for termites until a seminal paper was published by Inwood, Beccaloni, and Eggleton from the British Museum, published in Biological Letters. And this paper was entitled Death of an Order, a comprehensive molecular phylogenetic study confirms that termites are eusocial cockroaches. So this was quite a groundbreaking study because, and quite an in-depth study. I mean, the paper itself's only about 4, maybe 5 pages long, including the references. But the work that went into it was quite extensive, to say the least. They looked at more than 107 families within the Dictyoptera. They looked at more than 5 different gene loci, so it's 5 different points on each genes to very tightly narrow down the different genera that we've been looking at, or they were looking at. And they were able to show the relationships that are required to confirm these biological links. And so quite comprehensively, they showed that termites are not in a separate order. They belong to the order Blattodea, being the order of cockroaches. And their closest sister relative, which or clades, is the Cryptocercus species of cockroaches that you can see there. These are ground-dwelling cockroaches, very ancient cockroaches, and we can see a direct correlation and link between the termite families and Cryptocercus species. So what they showed is that termites evolved from these omnivorous cockroach ancestors that actually eat on timbers themselves, albeit very much different manner to the termites, and they're basically feeding only on damp timbers in timbered woodlands, that have a diploid reproductive system. The oothecae, or egg cases, are formed internally. They have what we call intraspecific proctodale feeding. Proctodale is my favorite word in entomology. This refers to anal feeding, and this is quite essential. We see it in many cockroach species, not just Cryptocercus, but anybody who attended my talk on cockroaches a few years ago at the British Pest Control Association conference would have seen with German cockroaches, it's very common as well. And it's how these insects pick up the flagellates, such as the Sachinobacillus that you can see there. They pick up these flagellates that form the gut fauna and are required for breaking down the cellulose. They're not able to break it down with the normal digestive juices. They use these flagellates to do so. And they pick up the flagellates from other cockroaches or other termites by proctodale feeding. And these cockroaches, Cryptocercus, were gregarious, which has led to the eusocial behavior that we see in termites. So here we can see an abbreviated schematic diagram. At point 1 here, we see where ootheca are formed, and you can see now where up at the top the mantids, praying mantises, and below that is the stick insects, and then you can see all the cockroach families falling below there. At break 2, we can see the formation of internal ootheca. So the mantids have external ootheca, but the stick insects and the cockroaches we see have internal ootheca. And then the real distinguishing point is when we come down to here, where we see the break within the cockroach order with particularly the wood feeding, the presence of gut flagellates, which we will also see in Blattidae and Blaberoideae, and proctodale trophallaxis for the spread of those, and biparental care. So both males and females will have a role in looking after the young. And then finally, we see the uniqueness of cockroaches in Termitidae, which is their eusociality. So what is eusociality? Oops. Termites are quite unique as social insects. Eusociality is where we see the insects forming more into where we have caste systems. So we have soldiers, we have workers, we have kings and queens. Now, we see this in bees, we see it in wasps, and we see it in ants. All those species evolved from solitary wasps, and they have complete metamorphosis. So the only social insect family that has an incomplete metamorphosis is the termites. We see in termites that both male and females have in the worker caste. They're not uniquely one sex only. And then we largely divide the termites up into what we call the lower termites, which is the more simplistic or earlier evolved termites. In these termites, we see they have the protozoan symbionts for cellulose digestion. So in other words, without those gut flagellates, they can't digest the cellulose. These are the most widely distributed termite species. And most commonly, when we're dealing with in a pest control situation, we're dealing with Coptotermes genera and Reticulotermes genera. And we'll cover that as we go through. We then have the higher termites, which are much more evolved. And in numbers of termites, these account for the greater majority of termite numbers, particularly in the tropical areas. Here we see the adult status workers don't differentiate, but what we particularly notice, they're fungal feeders. In fact, these are agricultural termites. They're true farmers, because what they do is they take the timber or the cellulose and they bring it back to the colony where they form fungal gardens. And so the termites are actually growing the fungus, and then they feed off the fungus, which gives them a much higher protein content food, which this leads them to being able to build much bigger nests and colonies, as again we'll look at later. And so probably 80% of all termite species are in what we call this higher termite category. So as I say, termites, then we see the same caste structure that you would be familiar with bees and with ants. So those three very large insects in the middle, they are queen termites. And this particular colony, there were three what we call physogastric queens. Physogastric is where you see this grossly extended abdomen, where the queens have developed into essentially just being egg-laying machines. They will lay 1,000 eggs per day. And the king termite is just down here, and his role is simply to fertilize the females or the queens. Those eggs are going to hatch out into the larval stage, which will then go into one of the other castes, being the soldier stages, which, as the name suggests, they're the guardians of the colony, into the worker stages who do all the work. They're the ones that go into the galleries, gather the food, bring it back to the colony under the guidance and guardianship of the soldier termites. And then, of course, we have the reproductives, which are going to be the ones that form the new colonies. To give you some scale there, that's my finger, and that's one of those physogastric queens. So as you can see, they are very, very big. When we look at the soldiers, we see three types of soldiers as a generality, and I am simplifying things here. There are many thousands of species of termites. In Australia alone, there's about 2,000 different species of termites. In Australia, we have about 400 species, but only about 20 of those species cause any economic damage. These are what we call nasuit soldiers, and here you can see that projection, which is referred to as a nasus. And what they do is they use that nasus, they produce a sticky latex gel, and they use that to fire the gel at any predatory species in defense of the colony. These are Nasutitermes genera, and these are higher termites. Then we see a wide variety of soldier species where we have these mandibulate mouthparts. And soldiers are the main way we determine the species from a physical perspective, if we're not using DNA typing, because these mandibles vary quite significantly and allow us to generally identify the species, although, as I will show later, we were often unsuccessful in our generalization. So here you can see powerful jaws, which they can use to attack and defend. Their main predators are ants, and hence why we see the termites hiding in these galleries to try and stay away from these predatory species. And then in species like Coptotermes, we see a combination of both. You can see the mandibles there, and you can also see that hollow at the front, which is where they can also produce that latex that we mentioned in the Nasutitermes. So that's the defensive mechanisms for the soldiers. And here you can see the soldiers and the worker termites. So you can very clearly see the difference between the Coptotermes soldiers with the jaw structure and the workers. Workers and soldiers, as I say, they can be male and female, or male or female, and they have no eyes, so they're quite blind. It's only when we get into the reproductive castes, the king, queens, and the future kings and queens, that we see eyes. And so the king and the queen, they lay their eggs, and we see the different caste structure through to the reproductive castes. And the reproductive castes will form wings. And then you'll normally see on a warm, very humid evening, in our case in Australia, normally around November, December, that the winged termites, or alates as we refer to them, will leave the colony in vast numbers, thousands and thousands, all leaving different colonies all at the same time. The air can literally be alive with these alates. They have these paddle-shaped wings that you can very clearly see there. Those wings will be discarded, and the future kings and queens will get together. And this is how we get genetic variation within the termite colonies. So slipping back into our evolution, as we said, they belong to the order Blattodea, which used to be Isoptera. So we resolved how to distinguish them by keeping the family structure we had, but altering it by creating Termitidae as the new family. And then the previous families became the subfamilies that you can see before. So Master Termitini used to be Master Termitidae, being a family. Now as a subfamily, it's a Tinae. And as you can see, there are 7 subfamilies of termites. Termites, I'm not talking too much about them. We find them mostly in Africa. They're grass feeders, and they will travel often above ground. And Termitini, we find these mostly in South America, and I'm not really going to cover them too much. Looking at those 5 other families, we can see how all the termite families have soldiers. They all have worker nymphs, but only the master termes, the rhinotermites, and the termitini have true workers. And only those latter two groups, the rhinotermitini and the termitini, which are main pest subfamilies that we deal with, have these physogastric queens. They all form nests or colonies. Uniquely, in some of the species of termites, termitini, we see vent pores, which I'll show in a moment. And it's only the termitini, as I mentioned earlier, that culture fungi. So this is a vent pore. This is from a Microcerotermes in Southern Africa that I took. You can see basically what they do is they form these big vents, and these vents will open up, and they use this to modify the temperature in the colony. Termites are quite incredible as to how they can control the temperature in their colonies. I was involved with a big case at a massive freezer complex, one of those freezers where you go into in a forklift truck, where whatever the air conditioning company did, they could not get the thermostat to be working correctly. And what I discovered on an inspection was the termite had built a colony in the insulation around the outside of that fridge. And so whenever they turned the thermostat up to drop the temperature, the termites increased the temperature in the colony and overrode the thermostat in the fridge. So here you can see they will open up these vents, or they will close down these vents to allow air to circulate through and keep the temperature down when they require to, and obviously seal them up when they need to maintain their internal temperature. And here you can see a close-up, because of course that's now an access into the colony, so we see it heavily guarded by the soldier termites. The most ancient of all the termite species or genera is the Master Termes. There you can see some Master Termes in amber, but really now there is only one species of Master Termes left. These are found in Australia. They are mostly north of the Tropic of Capricorn, but we have seen some spread south of Capricorn in the last 20 or so years. They're the largest termite in the world. But actually not quite that large, but they are a very large termite. There you can see one on my finger to give you an idea of the size of the soldier termites. And when those soldier termites bite, they do draw blood. They have a very vicious bite. And so these are Master Termes darwiniensis, or the great northern termite, and they do very extensive damage. We then have the drywood termites and dampwood termites. These were drywood termites in particular. These will largely spend their entire lifespan within a single piece or connected piece of timbers. So the entire colony can be located in just one piece of timber. And we see generally when we start looking at the dampwood termites, they don't really cause much economic damage because dampwood termites, they can only feed on damp wood, damp timbers. So we can solve those problems simply by drying out the timbers or removing the damp timbers and then improving the drainage. The drywood termites, again, because they're small colonies within the timbers, they don't necessarily do significant damage, so much as damage that will affect the aesthetics of the timber, unless we deal with Cryptotermes, and particularly Cryptotermes brevis, which is the West Indian drywood termite. And this in countries like South Africa, Australia, and particularly the United States of America and through the Caribbean, does enormous damage to buildings. And it's a $1 billion industry for the pest controllers to control this species. There's only one way basically to control Cryptotermes brevis, and that's fumigation. So we will see entire buildings go under tarpaulin to be fumigated with sulfuryl fluoride. That's actually what I'm working with on my trip. I'm up in Queensland at the moment, working with our sulfuryl fluoride product. And this is massive industry, particularly in California and in Florida in America, which would probably account for 80% of the usage of sulfuryl fluoride in the pest control industry. What we're mostly dealing with in Australia and Southeast Asia is the Rhinotermitini, being the lower termite, subterranean termites, and the termitini being the higher termites. These are all subterranean termites where the colony lives underground, and then they will travel under the ground and up into the buildings. I mentioned earlier about the fungal gardens, and there you can see a typical fungal garden. That particular colony had 4 of those football-sized fungal gardens around the nest. And this allows them to develop these extremely large colonies. This is in South Africa. This is in Thailand. In Australia, we have Amytermes, which is the magnetic termites. Every single one of those mounds is almost razor thin, and they're aligned to north-south, so they point magnetic north, so that they minimize the sun shining on the colony. And then we have the cathedral termites, also of Australia, and the Ensystex triotus, which are the largest termite colonies that we see, mostly up in the Northern Territory and far north Queensland and Western Australia. Typical molting through the termites is we see the eggs, which will hatch out into first couple of larval stages, and then they'll go into 1 or 2 lines, either the worker line or the nymphal line. The nymphal line will lead through to the alates. The worker line will keep going up to maybe 13 molts, and in those later stages, we will see the workers can molt off into soldier termites. I'm going to have to speed up because I'm starting to run out of time. So here we can see it again, where we see the egg through to the larval stage. The larval can go into 1 of those lines, the worker line or the nymphal line. Within the nymphal line, we can either see the primary reproductives, which is the winged reproductives we've spoken of earlier, or they can form what we call a secondary reproductive, an imaginal, where they will have wing buds, and but they won't leave the colony, and they will assist the queens. And then through the worker line, as we've already mentioned, the molts off into the soldier lines, but they can also form a third form reproductive, which is what we call apterous, which is, again, a king or a queen, but has no wing buds. And again, they will just support the queen in the maintenance of the colony. And here are just some interesting shots of how the wings form in those alates. Here we can see them folding out, forming in their full, and then we see them drying out, ready for the termites to leave the colony. So the dominant species that we see in Southeast Asia are Macrotermes, Microtermes, and Odontotermes, and Coptotermes were a peripheral species until we started building human habitations, when Coptotermes became the primary species in the urban environment. But as we see more and more urbanization, we're seeing Macrotermes and Odontotermes also starting to move into the urban environments and forming the business for the pest control managers. I'll just move through a couple of these sort of quickly. With some species, we see major and minor soldiers. In Shadorhinotermes, the large soldiers are all female, the small soldiers are all male. It's very variable as to the number of soldiers within a colony. We've always traditionally spoken of 10%, but you can see in that chart, it does range quite a bit, depending upon the species and the activity of the colony. But certainly with our species that we're dealing with mostly from an economic perspective, it's around that 10% of the colony will be soldiers. Sexing termites is not a very easy thing to do. It involves staining them, looking at them under a microscope, and people who've got a lot more patience than I have to do that. So a typical colony will live for 25 to 50 years. It will take 5 to 10 years to reach maturity. They will travel, in the case of Coptotermes, between 80 and 120 meters from that colony in search of food. And as you can see, anything from 400,000 to a couple of million termites in a colony. One thing that's very interesting is when I started working with termites about 30, 40 years ago, we used to deal with 4 species of Coptotermes in Asia. And through this DNA typing, we've learned that we were only the physical attributes that distinguished Coptotermes havillandii and Coptotermes vastata from Coptotermes gestroi were really just figments of our imagination, because they were all, in fact, Coptotermes gestroi. And Coptotermes travians, it turned out, we was also totally misidentifying. They were mostly Coptotermes gestroi as well. That's the main pest that we see in urban environments, and travians is only ever found in agricultural situations. So DNA typing has really revolutionized our species identification of termites. Termites have spread from their original sources. So Coptotermes gestroi spread to Brazil, where it was identified as Coptotermes havillandii, or misidentified. And it's also spread into Florida in the United States. Coptotermes formosanus, or the Formosan termite, is spread out of China up into Japan, and again out into the southern states of America, where it's a serious pest, particularly in New Orleans. France gave America the Statue of Liberty, and America gave France Reticulotermes flavipes, the most destructive species that's in France and Europe, although they do have some native Reticulotermes species as well. And in Australia, we've seen the Mastrotermes darwiniensis that I mentioned earlier spread into Papua New Guinea. What about the UK? There have been a couple of identified termite situations in the UK. There was a colony of Reticulotermes grassei located in Devon, which has since been eradicated. Mostly the temperatures and the soils of the UK are not very conducive to termite pests. In the Midlands, there was a case of the drywood termites, Cryptotermes domesticus. But again, with climate change happening, I think it's perhaps only a matter of time before we see more Cryptotermes, drywood termites in the UK, and perhaps even isolated outbreaks such as Cryptotermes brevis to keep an eye out for. So I think as a pest controller, it's very important you keep a sharp eye out on your inspections for something unusual. And a little rushed at the end, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve. It's such an interesting subject and so broad. I bet you could talk all day on termites.
Yeah, well, I took about 20 slides out of what I was originally going to talk about, and still had too much.
Indeed. No, it's a good sign. It's an interesting subject. I've got a little question from Philip here, and it's talking about the house in the first slide that you were showing. Was that something that had to be taken down? Was that house destroyed completely, or?
Well, it was the outside of the house was sort of largely saved, but internally it had to be totally gutted and renovated. Yes.
Yeah, just so much cost, isn't it? It's not just the getting rid of the termites, but the actual renovation afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I spent I've been 20 odd years with Ensystex, but prior to working with Ensystex, I was an industry consultant, and I worked very extensively with the major insurance company in Australia that insured pest controllers and investigated their claims. And we had claims for $200,000 of termite damage to properties occur. We had houses that had to be knocked up.
Yeah.
They can, if they're not found soon enough, they can cause very extensive damage. I mean, that's not normal. I mean, typical damage from termites to a house, $20,000 to $40,000.
I mean, yeah, that's
still expensive if it's your house.
yeah, absolutely. Philip also says, can wood be treated to prevent termites? Similar to say the wood destroying insects.
Yes, we have legislation in Australia which requires termite protection to be implemented in buildings prior to construction. That's one of the major areas for our company. We have a product called Trithor, which is like a blanket impregnated with the insecticide, and this is laid down at the time of the slab being poured to try and protect the upper areas of the building. But termites, remember, they can build these mud tunnels, so they can build around any barriers. The purpose of the protection is you cannot stop termites getting into the building. What you can do is make them reveal their presence when they're entering into the building. Mm-hmm. But again, one of the big problems we face is homeowners will build up garden beds over the inspection zones so the termites can still gain undetected entry.
Of course.
But again, that becomes a talk in its own right of what are the methods of termite control. There's 5 main methods, from baiting to the use of liquid termiticides, repellent and non-repellent, through to the use of borates, through to the use of fumigants.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the lifespan's 25 to 50 years, obviously depending on the temperatures. And I think someone's asking here what the lifespan is in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Is it similar? Is it different? Would it vary?
Yeah, I do a lot of work in the in the UAE. I'm there every year, or was before COVID. It's yeah, they're fairly similar. They're mostly dealing with higher termites in the UAE, and so everything that I've said is very much relevant for what's happening in the UAE too. And we're seeing increasing presence as we've seen increasing urbanization in the UAE. So we've seen an increasingly growing market in the UAE. And again, they do the pre-construction termite protections to new buildings.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. And as you said, do you remember those instances around the UK where they popped up and then and got dealt with? But I think it is only a matter of time with the climate change that we're seeing all sorts of different invasive species coming across, whether it's mosquitoes or stink bugs and all these things. So yeah, maybe we're going to be seeing.
I mean, termites, with the exception of drywood termites, because they can come in quite easily in containers, in wooden pallets, etc. I mean, in Australia, any wooden pallets have to be fumigated before they're allowed into the country. Mm-hmm. So, a colony like that could establish in the UK, and particularly, this time of year when it's, in the summer months. Much harder for the subterranean species to establish themselves, but I'm sure we see them coming in on yachts and other sailing vessels. But you've now got to get them. They've got to flight from that situation. They've got to get into the ground. They've got to form a colony. So much less likely that we would ever see that happen in the UK. Whereas if we look at, say, France, in contrast, they had some native species. And then, of course, we've seen particular Termes flavipes become imported from the US there because they had the conditions down in the south. And then what we're really seeing with the ground is that termites started in the south of France and they're moving up into the north of France and forever spreading through. So I think we'll see more spread through Europe, but not necessarily in the UK. Just as in Australia, we're seeing them spread to the south.
Indeed, yeah. I suppose it's tiny bit harder maybe to get to us just because we're an isolated island, aren't we? With the
Exactly, yeah.
so yeah, maybe that's a benefit for us.
No,
But
and again, if you look at Australia as a good example, Tasmania, where I live, it's an island up to the south of Australia, and we have no, despite the high pressure that we have in the mainland Australia, we still have no termites in Tasmania.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that beeping. I got my window open, someone beeping outside. Well, listen, Steve, that was fantastic. You finished on perfect time. So no, it was great, and I really appreciate you joining with us. What time is it there?
It's now coming on for 7:30.
7:30. Not too bad then. You can go and relax for the rest of the evening then. That's it. Yeah, and please stay with us and watch the other presentations if you can. That would be fantastic. But thank you. Really appreciate you joining us today, Steve.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Take care. Thank you. Fantastic. So yeah, guys, I don't know if any of you have ever really thought about termites too much. If it is something that you maybe feel that you found, get in touch with BPCA. We can maybe point you in the direction of assisting with identification. We've got consultant members that can do that. Also, you've got the non-native species secretariat, which is always a good tool for reference and maybe reporting things that you see and you don't recognise. So fantastic. Right. Okay.